Rocket League is a scene that has always had an issue with constructing a top 10 world ranking. We have the power rankings in the past, which has sort of been the most prolific ranking system that we've had. But it hasn't really been a good enough system to serve the overall world scene, the world rankings, because they're basically designed to fit within the individual scenes of EU and NA. And while that's fine because of what it was able to accomplish a year ago, considering the landscape a year ago, it's not a system that in any set of circumstances really qualifies for being able to construct a world top 10 best. And personally, I don't believe there is a solid way to construct a top 10 world best ranking system in Rocket League at the moment. Mainly because the systems that I would personally support using mostly rely on there being enough LAN events within a space of a short period of time to be able to run. And the truth is that we don't have enough of those. We don't have enough LAN events that accurately measure the level of the best from EU and the best of NA and the best of OCE and the best of the world in one roof being able to compete for one championship. They don't come that often. They are few and far between. And as a result, you can't really be able to construct a tournament like that. You can't do online events either because international competition between regions is virtually impossible due to the technical limitations of an online tournament. And that's just an unfortunate reality of the way that we live in Rocket League. Maybe in a year or so, we'll be able to definitively construct a top 10 world ranking system of Rocket League. But for now, we just have to set off with second best. Because I do believe that using the systems that I would personally use to quantify a team's position in the world rankings, we can actually take a look at the top 2 teams and kind of place them in where we would, or where I would personally put them in the world rankings. And that's what this video is going to do. I'm going to attempt to try and look at both G2 Esports and Gale Force Esports and rank them as the top 2 teams in the world and attempting to place them in either first or second, and which team will be at one another based off of 2 major criteria, and these are the 2 criteria that I use for all of my rankings, whether it be within CSGO or Rocket League or PUBG or any other game that I'm involved in. This is what I consider. Number 1, and high priority, LAN placements over the last 6 months within the context of the tournament. So it's okay to say something like, okay, we've had a top 4 finish in this one tournament and a top 8 finish in this other one, but in this first tournament we managed to beat, so loads, in the top 4 tournament we managed to beat loads of easy teams. In the top 8 we managed to beat, some we didn't really match up against a very, very strenuous team, and we went out really, really early. So within the context of each tournament, you've got to consider that in the way that they were able to place themselves within that tournament. So LAN placings and the context of it. The second thing is also going to be series victories over each other. So if it was a top 10 situation, if it's a top 10 ranking, we take a look at series victories among other teams in the top 10 on LAN. If it was something like a top 2 in this case, we're taking a look at series victories between each other. So we're taking a look at all the series on LAN that Gale Force and G2 have faced each other in, and we're going to take a look at those and we're going to decide based off that as the second priority, but still a decent measurement nonetheless compared to the LAN placings as well. Those are my 2 criteria for judging any team in a ranking system, and that's what I'm going to do over the course of the last 4 LANs of the last 6 months. All info is accurate as of the 5th of February. That's when I did the research for this video. This video may come out a few days later, but for the 5th of February, there are 4 LAN events that happened between them and 6 months earlier, which was the 5th of August. And that was Northern Arena, RLCS LAN, E-League, and the most recent DreamHack Leipzig. And we're going to go through those in chronological order to analyze exactly where we stand between these 2 sides. So Northern Arena is the oldest event on this list. It took place in October. It was an 8-team double elimination bracket, which is basically the standard for Rocket League at this point in time. And it is quite a significant one to our case study. Not the most significant, I don't think. But this is the only instance where both sides placed outside of the top 4, the top 4 placement within the tournament, and it's for in one case one of the only times in this time span that one of the teams placed outside of the top 8, and that team was of course G2. It started out playing against Cloud9, lost pretty spectacularly to them 3-1. We know that Cloud9 would go on to win the whole tournament as a result, so there's a little extra brownie points to G2 in terms of that, coming up against one of the hardest opponents in the whole tournament at that time. But what was really disappointing was the result against Ghost Gaming, losing 3-1 in that bottom lower bracket. We know that obviously Ghost would go on to have an incredible lower bracket run, only to be cut short by Energy's lower bracket run for basically the same stages as on the other side. And it was a pretty miraculous run for them as well. Ghost took down some very reputable names, and if it wasn't for Energy and their lower bracket run, that would have been probably one of the greatest lower bracket runs in the world, because taking into account that Ghost also managed to beat Gale Force of their own accord, then that would have been absolutely incredible for them to be able to win out in two series like that and go all the way to beat Energy and go further on forward. Of course, that's another story for another day, but the bottom line is that G2 lost both their series, and actually, based on the series scorelines, they only took 2 games throughout the entire thing. It was 1 game against Cloud9, 1 game against Ghost. And that's not a very encouraging sign, considering that you've just gone out in last place, especially when you consider what Gale Force were able to do in the exact same tournament. They actually made it past the first round, so already they played and placed better than G2. They was up against Mirage Sport Electronique, of course, which is still not the best team in the world. They didn't... all due respect to the players, I have nothing but love for anyone in the Rocket League scene, but you aren't going to do a whole lot in a tournament like this where you've got so many major power players in the game right now playing and being invited to this tournament directly. So I never really expected much from Mirage Sport Electronique. I don't really think anybody expected much from them, so they went out very easily to GFE. I think they were the other team that came in last place alongside G2. And, of course, Gale Force would go on to the semi-finals to face off against PSG. And, again, it's a situation where this is one of the top 2 teams at this tournament. PSG were in hot form, looked absolutely ridiculous all the way to the end. And they still took a close series against Gale Force. It still could have swung to Gale Force's favour. It was 1 game from doing so because the overall scoreline was 3-2. And then Gale Force would end up losing to PSG. PSG would go on to face Cloud9, drop to the lower bracket, and then face Cloud9 again in the grand finals where they got the bracket reset, but they weren't able to get the full series. So, as a result, that is going to leave Gale Force at the lower bracket when they faced off against Ghost. We already mentioned this, and they lost pretty spectacularly 3-0. So, didn't place much better than G2, but they still placed better than G2. And they managed to do, I think in every measurable aspect, do better than the G2 side because they managed to place 1 place higher, they won 1 series, and they even won more games total than that which G2 were able to bring together. So, all in all, Gale Force win out this round. They managed to beat out G2 at the Northern Arena Invitational. Excuse me. So we'll go on to the next LAN event, which is RLCS, the Season 4 LAN, and we know this one is the most prestigious event on the list. It is the World Championship. It is sponsored by Sonics. I don't think we can really argue much about this. This is basically one of the big dogs, the big hard hitters, when it comes to ranking these 2 individual teams, especially when we consider that Gale Force went on to win this tournament against Method. We know exactly how that ended up. We know that Turbo Pulsar became the 2-time world champion and he became the MVP of the tournament. We know how this whole game plays out. But we also got to consider that this is just one tournament in waiting between in wait between Gale Force and G2. Because remember that there's also a couple of things we need to take into account when talking about this tournament in context. Because in the quarterfinals, Gale Force had already met G2 after G2 knocked out Chiefs. Coming into this game, G2 didn't look 100% solid. That's for damn sure, to be honest. They only barely beat Chiefs, and it was 1 game away from being an upset. And when you're being upset by the Chiefs, that doesn't give you many good confidences going into the rest of the tournament. So G2 just about beat that particular game. They went up against Gale Force, and Gale Force swamped them out. It was a 3-1 score in the series, and then Gale Force would go on to sweep over the entire upper bracket and go to the finals and win the whole tournament. G2, meanwhile, after this loss, dropped into the lower bracket. They managed to claw their way back into top 4, and they managed to take a few players out in doing so. They took out Mocket 3-2, a close series. Mocket themselves, I don't think they're the world-class team. I don't think that they're world beaters. I don't think that they're world champions, but I definitely feel like they are the gatekeepers to the world champions, if you will. If you're not performing on your best, they will slaughter you and they will take you out. And if you're not worthy to become a world champion, then you are also going to get taken out relatively easily. So yeah, Mocket fell down 3-2. They faced off against PSG 3-1. Definitely not the hot form PSG compared to how they were performing at Northern Arena. But that's kind of the PSG nature. They are a streaky team. Sometimes they are hitting their ceiling like nothing else in the world. They're just going ham and destroying every single player in the game. And other days they're just hitting the bottom floor and they're not performing in series at all, and they're not performing well in any manner of respect. So to see them go down 3-1 isn't a major surprise, but at the very least it is something for G2 to be able to take a victory over. We managed to beat PSG. They're still a very capable team. Then they lost to Cloud9 later on in the consolidation match, which is understandable considering Cloud9's hot streak after the Northern Arena victory and their at the time recent signing with only a few months with Cloud9 themselves, before they were known as the Muffin Men. And they managed to beat G2 out of that last position, which places them 4th in the RLCS LAN. Gale Force's journey was a little bit more how do I put this? Strenuous, I guess you could say. They were taking some very convincing wins, which is really kind of the main name of the game, of course. They took a win above Ghost in the semi-finals in a 3-0 fashion. Ghost are a capable team. We saw them go through that epic lower bracket run in Northern Arena, as I mentioned earlier. And beating them there and then after they lost so badly in the Northern Arena LAN is really a testament to how far Gale Force had come between those two LAN events. Then they had a close affair against Method in the upper bracket finals, which was a 4-3 overall. And eventually Method would drop down to face off against, I think it was Cloud9. And then they would go on to the grand finals to face off against Gale Force one more time in a 4-0. Method were being worn down by that point. They played, like, you know, something like 13 games of Rocket League within just a few hours. So they did well considering their own sort of achievements to lose one series, then win one, and almost... or come into the other one, battered, bruised, get completely swamped out the server, but still able to hold a bit more of a fight than you would really expect. And yeah, you can take from that as you will, but the bottom line is that Gale Force definitely had a much more difficult run through the tournament, and they had a much more better showing comparing to what they had comparing to the teams that they had faced against. And the fact that G2 fell at the very last hurdle when they could have made top 3 really does kind of tip this slightly to the favor of Gale Force. G2 beat some reputable names, which is, you know, more credit to their favor, but at the time, I don't believe that any of them were in a position to win the whole thing. I mentioned about Rocket earlier, PSG being streaky, not 100% solid, versus Gale Force, who beat world-class teams in both G2 and Method, who I definitely feel like were teams to win the whole thing. They also managed to beat Ghost, who are capable of their own accord, not world beaters again, but still a very solid team when they want to be. And if we had seen them in the finals, then I think there could have been a bit more of a stronger case to give to them overall in terms of their standing in the land of scene as a whole. Even if Gale Force had managed to win it, it still would have been a very interesting rivalry going into E-League as well. But for now, that leaves 2 for 2 out of tournaments that Gale Force were able to place higher than G2 in this one, which moves us on to E-League. It's another very valuable event for our study as well, because we've had one event which serves as a tiebreaker, one event which really serves to cement their places, and E-League, which is another extremely valuable event, and another event that could have really catapulted us in a completely different direction, depending on if only a couple of games went a little bit differently. Because actually, Gale Force and G2 met each other in this tournament again, but they met each other twice. Once in the group stage, and once in the grand finals, as we all know. The group stage matchup, or the group stage as a whole, was a round robin, so it was going to be inevitable that Gale Force were going to face G2 anyway, and in fact it was actually G2's very last match. I think it was Gale Force's last match in the group stage as well. So seeing them go at it was really a testament to set to really where we were going to go, especially considering what we were riding on the line as well, because both teams were in a predicament where they were 2-0 in the whole system. So if I think that's about right. Yeah. No, that can't make sense. No, okay, right. Basically, we were in a situation where G2 lost and they had to rely on Ghost on Ghost beating the Chiefs. No, sorry, the Chiefs beating Ghost, excuse me. My brain's all over the place. I need to check my notes, in fact. Yeah, we were in a situation where if Ghost beat the Chiefs, then we would have seen a very, very different story, and G2 would not have been able to win the whole tournament because they actually lost that match against Gale Force. I think if Gale Force lost the match against G2, they would have been in a similar situation, but they managed to take them out very, very easily in this series. So it was a 3-0, very far gone scorelines. The first match was 2-1, which is close. Second match was 5-0. The third match was 2-0. So G2 didn't really show a whole lot in that series. It wasn't confident. It was lacking in a lot of ways. It didn't really feel very characteristic from them. So as a result, they put them in a situation where Ghost, if they won, would have been taking G2's spot in the final playoff bracket. But they didn't. Chiefs managed to pull the upset, and as a result, G2 went on to win the whole thing. Gale Force in the playoff bracket would face us against Cloud9 from the other group, that famous group of death, which had like Method, Cloud9, PSG, and I think the fourth one, I can't remember who the fourth one was, but those were the 3 names that stood out as like, okay, one of these teams going out is a huge deal for everybody else. But Cloud9 was one of the teams that came out on top in the second seed. 4-1 series, but some close score lines. Gale Force did actually take a definite confident win. You could say that Cloud9 had a good chance to defeat Gale Force. There's a lot of untapped talent, I think, in that particular squad, and I really want to see what they do in the next season of RLCS and what they do on the world stage as a whole, because I think they can make it to the world stage. And I think a lot like PSG, I don't think they're 100% in position to win a tournament, but I feel like they're on the cusp of doing so, and one good LAN performance will bring them the whole thing. So In this case, that was not the line of performance that they needed. I think that I think that it wasn't 100% there, and obviously Gale Force would go on to the finals. G2 would also go on against the finals to beat Mocket. Already taken Mocket out in the last RLCS LAN, which was an expected result as well. It was the best of 7 this time, so G2 outlasted them in the overall series, and that sets up a meeting between the top 2 teams in the world again, twice within the same tournament. This time, however, it's a best of 7, and it is a very close affair with both sides trading one-sided games between one another back and forth, 5-1s, 4-1s, 3-0s, and then the last 2 games went to the favor of G2 in close affair, 2-1 and 3-2. So Gale Force had some very, very good showings throughout this entire series, and eventually it would end up meaning that they had a close second place finish against G2, but G2 were the ones that took the gold medal, they were the ones that took the trophy, and the biggest prize in all of Rocket League history. So finally, they break the curse and they place higher than Gale Force, but one LAN placing isn't quite enough for G2 to overtake the at the time world's best. But DreamHack Leipzig, in my opinion, was probably one of the ones that could have done so, especially if Gale Force fell off the edge, and lo and behold, they actually managed to do so. Gale Force had a very easy time through the group stage, particularly the first round where they were drawn against Juicy Kids and Excel. Makes sense with the basis of the seedings. The first round was very, very easy for them because they were also seeded higher in that group, so they just went straight to the winner's match with that broken GSL system. I already made a video explaining that. In not detail, I want to say, but it's a quick video talking about the way the GSL system was set up and the context of the tournament around it. And Gale Force, as a result, had a very easy time going through. Juicy Kids and Excel had a bit more of a difficult time, but that's another story for another day. And then they went into round 2 of the group stage, where they were up against G2, Fnatic, and Secret, and this was the infamous group of death for DreamHack Leipzig. Basically because we had the 2 powerhouses, the 2 teams that you would expect to be standing at the end, and 2 other teams that had a lot of talent, but they hadn't really proven themselves in the last season at all. They didn't get LAN invites, they didn't get LAN qualifications, so as a result, they were stuck in this situation where they had this one event to really prove themselves. And if they had done so in this group, I would have pinned them to win the whole event off the basis of that. But neither team got through. Fnatic and Secret were knocked out of the hands of G2 and Gale Force, respectively. Oh, sorry, Gale Force and G2, respectively. But what was interesting about this one was the fact that actually Fnatic and Secret were drawn against each other in the starting match, and G2 and Gale Force were drawn against each other in the starting match as well. So we had basically the two big name talents and the two big name teams that you would expect to see in the finals going to face each other in the first match, and the 2 underdogs to take the winner of each will take on each other to decide in that moment, in that one isolated case, who was the best team. And it was an interesting time, let me tell you that right now, because once again we have another series between Gale Force and G2. We've already seen 2 series to the favour of Gale Force and 1 to the favour of G2. So this one would have been the tie breaker or the tie maker if in the case of G2 winning it. But in this case, they didn't. Once again, they went out 3-0. Wasn't quite as unconfident as it was in the E-League group stage. 2-1, 3-2, and 1-0 were the score lines of game 1, 2, and 3. But at the end of the day, Gale Force still managed to sweep them overall in the series, and as a result, they went forward to the winners match in the group stage. G2 fell down to face Team Secret, and Gale Force went against Fnatic. They moved forward. G2 beat Secret, then beat Fnatic to go forward in their own right and go to the other side of the bracket as the second seed of that group. Now, in the playoffs, as we all know, Gale Force didn't have a great time. Not at all. It was a 3-2 close series to start things off against Guess Who are the ex-Mocket side. And I've already mentioned how I don't think they are the world-class team. I definitely feel like they sat in a very static position over the course of the last 2 LANs. They weren't able to beat G2 in both Northern Arena or in E-League. Not both in RSCS or E-League. And coming up against Gale Force, I definitely felt like they didn't have the caliber to do that either. They were the gatekeepers, but as a gatekeeper, your responsibility is to weed out the unworthy, if you will. And in this case, Gale Force had a lapse in form, and they lost out at the very last game. And as a result, they shut them down, and Gale Force went out very simply. This is not a double elimination bracket. It's a single elimination round of 8. And that means that Gale Force weren't going through to the semi-finals, and Guess Who had a very decent chance to upset their way to another grand final, which would have been absolutely incredible, but not to be in this case. It was an unexpected result, but not majorly unexpected. I mentioned that in the DreamHack Leipzig video again. I feel like Guess Who are a very capable team. But going on to face against PSG was going to be another major upset that I don't think they would have pulled off. And eventually, PSG would eliminate them to go to the grand finals against G2. G2, on the other hand of the bracket, had a very nice time against some very tough teams, but managed to beat them either way within one game. It could have gone to another upset situation. In that case, that would have thrown this whole ranking straight out the window and really thrown everything into a loop, basically. Because Dignitas was the first team, 3-2, the big new dogs, the big new signing, the big new organization in the Rocket League space, and of course some very reputable names in the Applesauce and Xfibian lineup. Didn't think Dignitas would be able to beat G2, but they still took a very good fight, so I definitely believe that they have a lot of potential, and again, another team that I think that with another good LAN performance with a bit of development would be able to hold a decent deep run in a LAN tournament. And then NRG was up next for the G2 side in the semi-finals, and G2 beat them also. Again, close 4-3. I think that NA is a lot more closer than EU when it comes to their overall talent, so seeing NRG go like this is another nice thing that brings a smile to my face, because I like NRG. I think they're a great team. They've had some very good runs. Again, that lower bracket run in Northern Arena always springs to mind when I think of these guys. So, you know, seeing them in the semi-finals was great, but they weren't able to beat out G2 in this case, and G2 were able to go on to face PSG in the finals. An epic series of its own right. Definitely one of the series that I would go back and suggest that if you're not 100% certain in watching Rocket League esports, you'd want to go back and watch that particular series, because it was great and it got very, very close. It was down to a couple of different issues and small, again, uncharacteristic mistakes that G2 are making in that grand final that really pushed PSG to take it overall. Because it was a 4-3, remember? It went all the way to Game 7, and G2 are about this close, I think, from taking the whole thing as well. If JNaps hadn't made as many mistakes, I definitely didn't feel like he showed up to his MVP-level performance that he was holding throughout the entire tournament. Like, you know, from Game 1 of the first round of the first group stage, G2 had JNaps basically, like, been the backbone of the whole team. But during that grand final, there were a couple of issues, a couple of small mistakes there and then, which PSG were able to exploit, and them showing up in their own right, getting out of the streakiness, performing at the top level of their game, means that they were able to take this series at the very, very end of it. So that would mean that they take first place and G2 would take second. And that does mean that G2 take 2 out of 4 of the LAN events above Gale Force. And that puts us in a bit of an awkward situation when it comes to weighing up each team's individual achievements. But there's one more, I'll get to that in a second, because there's one more point I do want to make, because my second piece of criteria is, of course, the series victories. Because we've gone through a few of the series, it means that we are currently 3-1 in comparison to the series, with G2 conceding 3 games total to GFE, 3 best-of-5 series in particular. But G2 have that one win to their favor, and that is actually a slight best-of-7. So seeing that gives a slight edge. I think the best-of-7 outweighs best-of-5. I don't think there's really any controversial doubt in there saying something like that, but seeing that puts it a little bit less weighted, in my opinion, than everything else. And that's going to become important with all the rest of the smaller results that we've got coming up, and all the smaller results we've been through over the course of weighing up the LAN events, because we are literally in this situation where both teams have a title win each, a second place finish each, they have 2 placements above each other each, and at least 1 placement outside of the top 4. Except for Gale Force, who have 2 placements outside of the top 4, which is just slightly below where you'd want to be if you were competing against the likes of G2. We've got smaller problems with that as well, because, you know, even in that one tournament where they both placed outside the top 4, Gale Force placed higher than G2, but G2 still have 2 more placements above them, and the separation between those placements is much bigger in G2's favor than it is for Gale Force's favor, which is why this is super close. In the head-to-head results, you've got to try and look at this as the main tiebreaker as well. Because, you know, G2 have not won a single series against Gale Force except for that E-League Cup final. They lost in the RLCS quarterfinals, they lost in the E-League group stage match, they lost in the Leipzig Open match. And all these have been one-sided victories for Gale Force Esports, but there's that one best-of-7 series that got very, very close. So which one weighs up to which one's favor? That's really the question, really. Do I want to weigh G2 to win these head-to-heads because of their one best-of-7, or do I win Gale Force to win the the head-to-heads because they've won 3 series one-sided? I think I want to give that over to Gale Force overall in terms of the series wins. But now you've got to consider, do I weigh up the DreamHack and Northern Arena result for Gale Force in higher weight than I do the results of the head-to-heads? Because in that case, you know, G2 would be able to win that one relatively easily, but if I went up the head-to-heads, there are only 4, remember, there's only 4 head-to-heads in total, of which Gale Force have won 3, does that means that Gale Force would be able to take the title, or would they? How do you weigh this whole thing up? Which is really the difficulty in comparing these two teams. And one of the issues that I really honestly felt like scrapping this whole video project on the basis that I spent an hour trying to figure this out and really trying to weigh it up. So the overall conclusion that I came to was that both teams have pretty poor placements in several different individual circumstances. But Gale Force, overall in their spread of the tournaments where they finished ahead of the G2 side, they finished about 1 to 4 placings higher than G2, versus G2, who at their peak finishing about 1 to 7 placings higher than Gale Force Esports. And that is the major thing that separates it for me. I think that just gives G2 a very, very slight edge over the LAN advantage. And I think, therefore, a very, very slight edge over them overall, even when weighing up the head-to-head results. And that's really where I draw the line right there. Just that one little slight caveat in terms of the way that the separation is between G2 and with Gale Force. I think G2, at the moment, are the best team in the world in Rocket League. But that's not saying much when you consider how closely weighted these two teams are, how many first placings they've had, how many top 4s they've had, how much dominance they've had over the Rocket League scene. And when we take a look at the Rocket League space over the next couple of months, with RLCS coming up, with the LANs that are ready to get placed in, there's a large amount of rivalry between these two sides, especially if we see them face against each other, because that one series could mean the tipping point between Gale Force taking the lead back from G2, or G2 extending the lead above everybody else. Because, that next match is going to be so high stakes. You know that if they win that one, then they'll become probably the best team in the world as a result. If they place higher, very slightly higher than any one of those teams, even if it's just one placing higher, then we're looking at, a complete role reversal of the way the whole thing works out. As well as that, you've got to consider when the next LAN event is coming up, because my personal system and the system I've used for this video is within 6 months. So by the time the next LAN event rolls around, we could be seeing Northern Arena get knocked off entirely. At that point, we're focusing on the championship victories of G2 versus Gale Force. And in that case, just losing that one, it means that G2 actually do take the advantage above Gale Force overall. So there's so many different factors to weigh up. And I'll really be excited to see how these teams take that into account when they try and go into the next few months of LAN events, because when we do meet, it'll be a clash for the ages because of how much is really at stake. And that just, for me, makes Rocket League so much more exciting, because there's so many more storylines to take out of this one. There's so many more opportunities to really become a fan of either G2 or Gale Force, or represent your fandom of either side. It's just a great time to be a Rocket League fan overall, and to see these two at the top is just an exciting prospect to see, how the best from both regions will try and face up against each other.